Well, here we are at Friday. Isn't that exciting? The week seems to have gone by so quickly. I'm going to talk about something which is actually extremely significant for the voice and choice theme of this year's festivities. And it's sometimes difficult to motivate, but I'm going to do it very briefly like this. If you have no way of showing in terms that people who make policy, people who implement policy understand and appreciate and respect, of showing that something is being done or something is not being done, and also, more importantly, to measure the extent to which things that the CRPD is requiring have been done or not been done, then you might as well have air for rights. Without some way of implementing and monitoring rights, the rights are really political rhetoric, which is good and fun, but it will not get anything done. So voice and choice depends, in the end of the day, on monitoring effectiveness of action and monitoring its effectiveness. Now, what I want to talk about today are two kinds of tools that are normally used in this context. And the structure of this talk is very simple. I want to focus on Article 31, but put Article 31 in a context which has already been done very nicely by Gautier and other people with respect to 33, and it's the context in which this appears. Then look at some issues that normally are not talked about, namely data, and the data that we're interested in, namely data about human beings, and the difficulties, the paradoxes, the puzzles, and the problems with data, which normally people say, oh, that's easy, that's the easy part. Well, it's actually the hard part. And finally, to talk about human rights indicators, the challenge of developing them, and some brief sets of issues with respect to indicators that I will flash through very quickly, usually with examples so it doesn't become too theoretical and abstract. All of these issues have to be resolved until you get a tool that actually can be used. My challenge is to present to you the picture that is both complete and not too pessimistic, because there are challenges here, but at the same time accurate, because there's no point going into this thinking it's simple. So this talk started by situating Article 31. There it is, Article 31. See how quick I can do this? I just want to highlight some of the words that are significant here. Appropriate information, including statistical and research information, but not any old information, not data for data's sake. And the Convention is very explicit, very carefully crafted on this point. It is information to enable states parties to formulate and implement policies to give effect to the present Convention. Now that qualification on data, that characterization of data, is the crucial thing. There are other features of this article which I could spend some time on, having to do with accessibility, the input of the disability community in the development of data, and issues of what are called disaggregation, but I'll skip that bit, because what I really want to do is put Article 31 in the context of the other articles, or at least the relevant articles. You have already been informed about the role and the importance of Article 33.1 focal point, the coordination mechanism and focal point, and the need for, as designated by 33.2, of a implementation monitoring mechanism, which is created, interfaced, and invigorated and animated by persons with disabilities in 33.3. I'm going to give you the focus of 31 as input or characterization of input into this process. So that's the picture that we have. The interaction between the components of 33 and the role of 31 in this monitoring mechanism. Okay, here are some of the, what I call, simple truths of disability. Anytime you have information about people, as opposed to objects, chairs, or puppy dogs. Anytime you have information about people, it is difficult to get this information. It is expensive to get this information, and it's difficult to interpret. People are complex. People have cultures. People have linguistic differences. People have other differences, which makes a standardization of information extremely difficult. It's also, this data is open to the classic scientific criteria of validity and reliability. Validity is the data true to what it says it's true about? And reliability, is it something that you can rely on in the sense that if you used a question and a questionnaire to get the data, if you used it several times, you'd get the same kind of data. The data can be relied on. Now, these are very, very standard scientific criteria, but in the case of data about people, data about, in fact, what we want to know about is participation of people with disabilities, there are immediately some difficulties that are just a function of the nature of this data. It is often, it has already come up, said that data comes in two forms, qualitative and quantitative. Well, in the context of monitoring the convention, it's the quantitative stuff which actually does the most work. Does, as Chairman Quinn used to say, does the heavy lifting in impressing upon policymakers the importance or the significance of certain sorts of moves. Quantitative data is more, so to say, scientific. It's more, has more of an impact on policy. Its downside, the difficulty with quantitative data, is because it's quantitative, it has sometimes suffers from what's called false precision. That is to say, whenever you put numbers attached to pieces of information about people, the numbers, which are incredibly precise, hide the fact that the information that you're providing is very fuzzy, namely information about people. So we call that false precision because you end up making claims which are much stronger and more precise than you think they are. Also, there's a kind of false transparency to quantitative data. It looks like it's telling you exactly what it's saying, but it's always really open to interpretation, and that also makes a difference. So what we say is, to hell with quantitative, let's go qualitative. Let's get warm and fuzzy about our data, and let's look at the voice of the people speaking to us. Now, first of all, the voice of people with disabilities, and hearing that voice, qualitative information, is consistent with statements made throughout the convention about the need to hear from people with disabilities. It's realistic, it's concrete, it's highly relevant, but it suffers from something. Everything I know about life comes from Indians that I have read or have talked to. I'm addressing this to our colleague up there. Because as it happens, Indians are some of the brightest people on earth. And the one I want to mention I did before is Amartya Sen. Because Sen addressed ourselves to a problem with qualitative data, which is an embarrassment in the disability context, but has to be understood and taken seriously. Technically, this is called a framing problem, but non-technically, it means this. There is no reason in the world to believe that the fact that you have disability means that you're expert on data about disability, because you simply, like other human beings, may not know what's going on. Things about environmental obstacles which you confront, you may mischaracterize them, you may underestimate the impact of them, primarily because you're directly involved with them. For example, the obvious example, if you're in a wheelchair, you come up to a street and there's a 3-inch curb there, and you can't get over the curb. What is the obstacle? Well, the obstacle is the bloody curb. You can't get it. It's a physical object. Well, actually, the obstacle is not that object so much as perhaps the city council's decision not to spend money to give you a curb cut. The real obstacle is not the one directly confronting you. The real obstacle is something which you may not know anything about. Secondly, Sen argues that perceptions are highly variable. It's not just a matter of being subjective, because I have no problem with subjectivity, but the perceptions that people have of things that influence their life the most are often distorted by the direct impact. The only reason to be happy with quantitative data is not because it's objectively true in some divine sense, but it's impartial. In impartiality, the fact that it is not directly linked to someone's perception, but hopefully a community's perception, is the only reason really to favor quantitative data. But later on I'm going to talk, and I'll give you examples of qualitative indicators. An indicator is something for which qualitative data would be useful, to show you that they have a use as well. Now, where do we get data from? The kind of data that I'm going to be calling disability data, which is just a shorthand way of saying any information which could be used in the Article 31 sense to help a state determine the extent to which, or if, it is implementing the convention, comes from some standard sources. Census information, which is shitty as hell, but is regularly done and therefore very easy to acquire. Thematic population surveys, health, economic and social surveys that are put on, employment surveys and whatnot, which give themes of information, which are only as good as they are, technically speaking, disaggregated to people with disabilities. Which means if you have information about employment, but you have not made a distinction between those with and those without disabilities, or men and women, elderly or the young, or whatever criteria, then you won't be able to see the differential impact of policies on one group of people or another. Or a more brief way of putting this point, you can't identify discrimination. Unless you have a way of segregating, separating, or technically disaggregating this information from these thematic surveys, questionnaires, is not going to do you much good. Administrative records are often used, usually secondarily. These are records of disability pensions, worker compensation, or any kind of service in which individuals are tracked by virtue of their service use. Another example of data, very different data, is called event-based data. And this feeds into a distinction, which I'll get into later, between monitoring success and identifying violations. Because there really are two ways of monitoring the effectiveness or the impact of a human rights convention. You can either very successfully and very dramatically point out discrete examples of events of torture, of events of discrimination in employment. And that is high impact information, but it's focusing on where things went wrong. The monitoring that is mostly identified under Article 31 and monitoring mechanisms are so-called compliance monitoring. That is to say, the extent to which things are improving or not. So you're looking at the extent to which the convention is being complied with. But events-based information can be very useful in its own way, often dramatically useful. And research findings, expert judgment, the rest of it. So this collection of sources of data, this pool of information, is available for this purpose under Article 31. But every source that we have has problems of its own. General population surveys, or the so-called disability surveys, which are all over the place around the world. There are, I think at last count, 180 of them operating continuously, and you saw one of them, the Irish Disability Survey, is an example, in fact, one of the best examples of a good disability survey for reasons I will tell you about soon. But they're expensive. Now what happened to the Irish survey? They went once and then bang, it's over. As you'll see later on in this discussion, a survey that is not longitudinal, that doesn't go from year to year, doesn't really help. You get a baseline, you get 1 year's worth of information of where things stand, but monitoring is dynamic. You're looking over time to see if things are getting better or worse. And if you don't have the same information coming in on a regular basis, then you won't know that. But the reason that you don't is that these surveys are hideously expensive. When I was working at the World Health Organization looking at surveys, mostly health surveys for obvious reasons, the rule of thumb was for every question, it costs between 1 and 1.5 million euros to put a question in, an existing survey, if you're going to do it in a way which covers more than one country. International surveys are extremely expensive. The World Disability Survey and the World Health Survey that WHO did in the early 2000s cost $85 million, courtesy of the Gates Foundation. Thank you, Bill Gates. And the chances of it ever being done twice are almost zero. This is a survey of 180 countries. Well, also, these surveys were not done with the CRP in mind. So, if you get information that's relevant to an article in the convention, it's almost by chance. It's unfocused. Disability surveys themselves, when they are called disability surveys, have a huge problem, which I'll get to a bit later, called framing. You will see that most disability surveys, I think I have examples immediately, but I'll give it to you, start off by saying, because of a health problem, do you have problems, blah, 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 blah. This is a standard structure for what is called a disability survey. Because of a health problem, do you have difficulties managing your day-to-day life? The framing issue is you start, these are all surveys that are in self-report, that is to say, you're asking people to report back to you. And if you frame it that way, where does the mind go? To the body. We don't want it to go to the body, we want it to go to the world, where the barriers are. But if you start a survey, as many surveys are started, because of a health condition, do you have problem? You're setting a pattern of response that tends, even with disability advocates answering the question, to focus on the body. Okay, so here's the problems. I'll give you actually just two. There are many that could be gotten. The problems, the obstacles in getting disability data. Most disability surveys are focused on health conditions or impairments. We don't need that information as such, and I will give you an example a bit later in which you need actually never ask a question about the body. You only ask questions about the world. What we need is information about these barriers that people have. Why do we need this? Repeating a slide from last Monday. Because Article 1, and our dear Rosemary isn't here, unfortunately, but I agree it's not a definition. It's a characterization, it's a conceptualization. It's not a legal definition. But in Article 1, we are told that people with disabilities are those with impairments who which in interaction with barriers cause limitations of participation. So what we need is information about these barriers. Well, let me give you some examples of what we are looking at. Now, I start with Australia, not because I don't like Australia, but even Australia, which is very, very advanced in this area, this is the census question. Remember, census is a shitty place to have questions about disability. It has the value that almost every country does a census. So it's a sort of minimal standard of data collection. Most countries that can afford data collection on a population level do censuses. Well, this is what the Australian census questions are. I won't read the preamble, but look at the list. If this is just a question, disability, this is a question about diseases. This is their disability question. The Washington City Group, which is a UN organization or group that is looking into coming up with the ideal set of census questions that can be used around the world, many countries are participating in this, are actually worse, to my mind, because their questions look at difficulty seeing, hearing, walking, etc., without any way of addressing participation, employment, or obstacles. So what you get with these questions is a prevalence discussion of impairments, which is important in its own right, but it's not going to get you in the right place. Certainly not. These questions are utterly useless for monitoring the convention. I promised the Irish census question. This is the Irish census question, and it starts off on the left-hand side with 15 questions. Do you have, and there's a list of health conditions, blindness, conditions that substantially limits one or more physical activity. In the next question, if you answer yes, then you move to functional activities, learning, getting out of the house, doing things, as opposed to having diseases or health condition, doing things, a good move, called the move toward functioning. And then after that, they make the next step, which gives it really a nice, well, not the census, but the disability survey of 2006, starts asking questions about, are there any of the following aids, specialized equipment that would help you, that you need, but do not have? So you then go to the barrier of not having assistive technology, and after that you look at things on the negative side, and this was already mentioned by Eleanor, namely, what is the main reason for not having a job? And the main reason is transportation, is able to work a job but not geared to accommodate your disability. So it's the obstacles are not addressed to the body, but rather, and this is a good move. This is very nice. The Irish and the Canadian, which I don't have here, no I don't. The Canadian and a couple other countries, the Spanish, a new Spanish survey, has this focus. You identify functional problems. Do you have difficulties walking? Do you have difficulties going to work? But then you also get the other side, the important other side of the information. What is it that actually prevents you from doing what you want to do? And with that, you finally have information that is relevant to the convention. Because the convention is identifying primarily barriers. We can appeal to God or Yahweh or whoever you wish with respect to impairments, but I don't want to get you depressed. I mean, we're just fucked when it comes to that because we're human beings and we fall apart. So don't try to get it. But we are responsible for our environments. We have states that can make our environments better. And that's where rights apply. Not to making it less likely that we become sick or die, because that's not going to happen, but make less likely we're discriminated against, irrational obstacles, or other lack of accommodation. So what kind of information do we need for the convention? That is the information. Very few instruments do so. I'm going to give you Ed Sims, or its new manifestation. This is from Eurostat, which is another great example that follows, actually preceded the Irish example. Why are you limited in the type or amount of work, paid work, lack of job opportunities, family responsibilities? The health conditions there, but it's one of 11 possibilities. So that the self-report can massage out of the individual their perception of what causes their difficulties in participating in work. This is an underdevelopment survey, which I want to talk about very briefly, but it's very important, and I'd like to get your impact on it, actually. This is a joint endeavor which is ongoing between the World Health Organization and the World Bank on what we call a model disability survey, and I'm lucky enough to be part of it. Its focus, and let me just pick work and schooling as a sample question, is getting things done as required at work a problem for you? Now, this is a survey intended for a general population. You can take my word for it, I can't give you the whole thing. There is never once a mention of impairments. Never once a discussion of health condition. This is a question asked of everyone. Do you have a problem here? If a person answers yes and has this Likert 5-6 point scale, you get a portrait of individuals that have problems. The immediate question that comes up is, hold it, what if it's racial discrimination? What if it's gender discrimination? What if I'm poor? I could have those problems. You're right. You're right. But you don't frame it in terms of disability in the question. You psychometrically extract it in the analysis. And it's just an experiment to see if this works. Later on in this question, after all these questions about what's your life like, describe your day. Do you have problems doing this? Is it a difficult thing for you to do that? At the end of it, oh, by the way, do you have this condition? Are you blind? Are you this? Are you that? At the end. Now, what difference does it make? It makes all the difference for the reason I already gave you. If you start off by saying, because you're blind, do you have problems in black? The report focuses initially, because you're directing them to do so, on the condition and its impact. If you put it this way, is getting to work a problem for you? The initial response is, what's my life like? Well, it is a problem for me. Without focusing that problem on your health, on your functional status. Now, this may not work, but it's an attempt to get away from this age-old problem of disability data, of sending it out so that people, even who are aware that the environment disables them, even who are conscious of that, are, by virtue of the dynamics of these kinds of questions, focusing on their problems, not the world's problems. We shall see. Well, the second problem, remember I had two. The first problem is that we have an impairment focus. The second problem is that it's tempting, primarily because these things are expensive, to measure what's easy to measure. And a friend of mine gave me this quote and claimed it was from Albert Einstein. Well, it's not, although it'd be nice if it were. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. This is a nice way of putting the same point. The problem with disability population health surveys and other surveys is that if it's easy to get the information, you tend to go for it, even though it is bugger all relevant to what you're talking about. There's a lovely little joke, if you remember from last year, where you come out of your pub one night and you see someone under a street light crawling around on the ground, and you say, have you lost something? Yes, I lost my keys. And you go on the ground and you crawl along with them, and after an hour of this you say, Wow, I don't think it's around here anywhere. Are you sure you lost your key? Well, no, actually I lost it over there in the dark, but there's more light here. This is exactly the state of disability survey information. This is what Eurostat constantly does. It's hard to get information about what's relevant, so you go for what's irrelevant and get that information, and then you have it. Of course, it's no use to you, but you have it. You look under the lamppost instead of where the problem is. You look at information about diagnosis, because that's easy to get, typically. You don't look at information about stigma, which is really hard to get. Well, I'm not saying this because I or anyone else has an easy answer to this, but this is the problem. Okay, here are our challenge in data. We need to get a survey, an instrument, something that collects information for Article 31 that captures disability in the CRPD sense. And by that I mean captures the fact that disability is not a phenomena of the human body as much as it is the phenomena of the interaction between people and their world. And that information needs to be captured. Information that focuses on barriers and information that could be comparable, that is longitudinal over time. Huge data. Only if you disaggregate data can you identify discrimination, and only if you have longitudinal data can you substantiate that this discrimination is getting worse or getting better. You need it over time. Okay, the challenge of human rights indicators. Okay, I can do it. What is an indicator? Well, an indicator is simply a proxy device, a number that has two basic properties. A phenomena, I don't know what to call it. A variable, technically speaking. You can measure it, and it represents something you're interested in. It is a proxy for something you're interested in. The clearest examples, since this is where indicators came from, is socioeconomic indicators. The unemployment rate of a country is a proxy, is a indicator, there's no other word I can't avoid, is an indicator for something about the economy's health. We can measure it, and that's good, but it points to, it isn't the same as, it points to it. The consumer price index, all these things, they measure, so to speak, the health of the economy. Measuring the health of the economy directly is impossible because it's too complex, there's too many factors involved, it's hard to imagine how you get that information. So you identify things that you can measure which are representative or indicate or point to. When and if we find ourselves developing indicators for human dignity, you can be sure that the indicators will be things like, do you feel that people around you treat you with respect? And if you say no, that it points to lack of dignity. It's not the same thing as lack of dignity, but it's as close as we can get and satisfy the other major requirement. You can measure it. You can collect this information and measure it. Indicators are always proxies, are always substitutes for something else, but they have to be measurable in one of two ways. They're either measurable in the sense of ordinality, sorry about the technical term, you say things are getting better or worse, or optimally, if things are really going in your favor, you can get cardinality, which is to say things are getting 2.34 times worse. You can actually quantify it. Usually we go for bigger or more or less, but ultimately, and I'll show you reasons a little later on, it'd be nice to have numbers attached to it. But they're tricky to get right. Let me give you an example of a perfectly awful indicator. And it's an indicator I'm calling average per capita income. Now, keep in mind what we're trying to do here is have a something that represents the health of your economy. Average per capita income means how much people make on average across the economy. And I have two graphs, spectacularly drawn on my computer, I have to say. The artistic value of these are immense. The first one is your standard bell curve, which is say that this is supposed to be divided by in tenths, but I didn't get it right. They're ninths. I ran out of space. But anyway, so the population on the left-hand side for the population, the left-hand side, that one. So the people are, poor people are a small number of people, and as you go up into middle class, more and more people are represented. This is supposed to be a standard representative. And if you wanted to do a average, watch this folks, that would be your average. I mean, it's right there as you would expect. That's the average per capita income. Suppose that, just say Mitt Romney won the election in the United States, and you would have all the money going uphill to the very rich people, as in the second drawing, where all the lower earners and the middle class take a cut, and all the difference goes zipping up to a very small segment of the population. Your average increases. This is inevitable. As long, and let me give you another example that I just read about. Unbelievably, the 6 members of the Walmart family control 42% of the US economy. Their income, of course it's not income, but their income is equivalent to the bottom 42% of the country, which is, if you think about it, for what's your population now, 330 million, is probably about 140 million people. Their incomes, when you all amass it, account for 6 people. You don't have to be Karl Marx to think this is a problem. But what if, after the election, because of redistribution of wealth, these 6 people acquire much more income, and everyone just sort of creeps up a little bit. So that at the end of the day, as long as everyone creeps up a little bit, at the end of the day, you count again, and these 6 people now have 50% of the income. That's an increase in average per capita income across the board. So the point is, if you use this indicator, is that supposed to be some proxy for a better, healthier, whatever you want to say, economy? No. And that shows in this adjacent area of economic and poverty, if you like, how tricky indicators are. It's easy to get this information, and it says something very, very dramatic, but it really misleads very much misleads us. Well, that's the problem. What's the solution? The solution is a human rights indicator, and I think, once again, my colleague up there in the second to last row has a very good definition. I will read it out. Indicators, human rights indicators, are indicators that are linked to human rights treaties standards and measure the extent to which duty bearers, the state parties, are fulfilling their obligation and right holders, people with disabilities, are enjoying their rights. Now, it's very straightforward. It's just an indicator about the degree to which people are enjoying their rights and the degree to which people who are, or entities responsible for them, the states, are fulfilling their obligations. That's defining them is easy. And also identifying their uses. Their uses of indicators are phenomenal, primarily for groups of people with disabilities, DPOs, because they are tools of communication that speak the language of policymakers. if you had indicators, if you had the data that could feed into them, you don't have to make an advocacy case, you just make a science case. And that is always going to be much more closely listened to. As tools of measurement, you can actually assess, determine where the problems are. And that will also be an important issue with respect to the CRPD, because the substantive provisions of the CRPD cover all aspects of human life, and it's going to be inevitable that, as has already been said, there are some priority issues or some priority decisions that have to be made with respect to where additional resources or the breaking down of barriers or the addressing of issues has to be made with respect to these different substantive areas. Do we look for inclusive education and save employment for later? Or do we look at employment primarily and hope that later on we can come back to increasing healthcare budgets and access to healthcare resources? So some sort of adjustments are necessary, but without comparable information about where you are, you can't make those decisions or advocate for them. It's a planning tool as well. So the indicators are phenomenally useful, not only from an advocacy point of view, but also from a policy point of view. At the end of this talk, I'm going to give some of the reasons that people have objected to indicators, some of the worries that they have. But one of them that might come out right at the moment is that they are over-scientifize, over-technologize human rights. And we'll get to that issue because there are some non-ignorable problems with it, which that objection points to. Well, one thing for sure, they speak the language that those who are engaged in making policy decisions also speak. And speaking the same language is extremely effective. Another objection is that they increase the likelihood of an adversarial relationship between people with disabilities and their governments by, in a sense, concretely measuring failures. Might as well as successes, but failures. My response to that is, what is the alternative? Vigorously waving your arms would be one, or marching in the streets, another very effective, historically effective, but having something which gets you to a negotiation position that makes it possible for you to negotiate informatively, I think is a better solution. Okay, these are a couple preliminary distinctions. As I said, I wanted to give you a survey of the kinds of battles that have to be waged to get indicator development in the CRPD resolved. First decision, as I already mentioned, are you going to go the compliance route or the violation route? Are you going to identify problems or horrible situations, like situations in various mental establishments in Europe and other sorts of cases, or look at the more gentile, as we say, indicators and measurement compliance approach. Obviously, both strategies are valuable. What kind of rights? Now, we've already, in the course of this week, made the point, which has been made several times, that there used to be a very hard and fast distinction between civil and political rights and social, economic, and cultural rights, with respect to a whole bunch of features, one of which was indicator development. There's less of a concern about that now, because there are certainly ways, technical and conceptual, of avoiding this. But keep in mind, there are differences between basic rights of personhood and rights to resources and opportunities. Oh my goodness, that should this is the first time I made a mistake. The core and absolute should be up there with civil and political, and the progressively realizable should be up there with social and economic. I want to entertain a third category, which actually doesn't have anything after it, namely solidarity rights. Maybe it's just me, but I have a fundamental allergy to liberal individualism. And the rights, civil, political, and economic, are classic Lockean rights that go back several hundred years. What we need for the rest of this century, I think, is to look more carefully at rights of community, the rights of the environment, the rights to being a human community, solidarity rights, which are arguably in the interstices of the convention. They're there somewhere, but one of the things I think needs to be done in the future is to extract them. Okay, 3 issues. One I've already mentioned. To give you an example of the difference between a qualitative and a quantitative indicator, here's an indicator. Proportion of applicants for advertised jobs who have disabilities and were hired. A quantitative indicator that gives you a ratio between, if you had the data to substantiate it, between those who applied and those who got the jobs. Standard proxy indicator of discrimination in employment. A qualitative indicator that is parallel would be the level of satisfaction experienced by applicants to advertise jobs who had disabilities. So you're tapping in to a sense, a subjective sense, obviously, of the quality of the experience in terms of satisfaction or some other quality of life or some other kind of indicator. Keep in mind that although the second one is qualitative, it doesn't take too much effort to turn it into quantitative, because it's level of satisfaction, and if you give 5 options from low to high, then you just add them up and get an average, and bingo, you have a quantitative indicator that could be created from it. Well, as I mentioned before, quantitative indicators have more impact. Qualitative indicators are subject to problems, framing problems and distortions. The most famous distortion is the difference between being told you have a 10% chance after this operation of dying versus being told you have a 90% chance after this operation of living, and everyone avoids the 10% chance of dying in favor of the 90% chance of living. This is a standard issue that has been researched to death about how we react to information, especially information about probabilities. But it's only a problem for qualitative indicators. The last point is, still in all, it's probably inevitable that some human rights values will have to be and can only be understood qualitatively, and dignity is the most obvious example. Another controversy is whether your indicators should be across the world or should be specifically tailored to the circumstances of individual countries. A universal indicator, say Prohibition 15, what we were talking about yesterday, is a ban on torture right around the world. There's no, but if your country doesn't have enough money, you can torture. There's no qualification of that. And the advantages are that if you have uniformity, then there's no singling out of special focus on a particular country. The downside of universal indicators, it doesn't allow for cultural and economic differences. If you remember Monday, it seems like a long time ago, I said universalism and cultural sensitivity are in a balance, these two things. And the delightful comment over here, a woman who's no longer here, should we take into account cultural differences? Maybe in some cultures they think women are inferior. She said, get over it. I mean, that's one way to address this issue. Cultural differences, screw them. We're going to go for universal across the world. I hesitate to say that, not only because It's not as if I'm an anthropologist. I don't know where Nora is here. I'm not saying that, what's good in one country is not good in another country and all that sort of stuff. I'm not a relativist, but certainly you have to take into account the specific cultural and economic conditions, and that's what country-tailored indicators are supposed to be. So, it's important that indicators are cross-culturally comparable. That way you can set standards better. You can see what's happening in one country versus another, and that argues for universal, much strongly for universal. And the problem with country-tailored is every country-tailored indicator is effectively a progressively realized indicator, effectively. And if you were much too sensitive to differences in cultural differences, in the significance of cultural differences, in effect you'd be turning every right into a progressively realizable one. On the other side, and there's always another side, country-specific indicators are context-sensitive, and that's always a good thing. More appropriate, more realistic, more feasible for the different country. But perhaps the last point is the most important. It increases compliance if the indicators make sense for the country. And we want increased compliance. So the difficulty between, or the balancing act between universal country tailored indicators, as most people agree, is you need a bit of both. I'm going to skip that for the moment and just give you the standard story on indicator frameworks. A lot of ink has been spilled on what an indicator framework is, and I'm going to, not ink, but images, give you some more of this. The front runner, by everyone's standard, is Paul Hunt's Office of High Commission on Human Rights, structure, process, and outcome structure or framework for indicators, which I'll explain in a second. The misinformed Maastricht indicators, actually invented by a philosopher in 1978, Henry Shue, is respect, protect, and fulfill, and you've already had some experience with that earlier in the week. There's also the UN Development Activity Program had participation, adequate progress, and effective remedy as categories of or a framework for indicators. And when I look at that, sometimes I see it as really quite applicable to the CRPD for a variety of reasons. And there's also Katrina Tomaszewski, if I get that right, the so-called 4As, which was used for inclusive education, the availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. We use this a lot, these 4As, in rehab services when we're assessing rehabilitation services and other, presumably it would be applicable to any kind of service provision. And it really hits the spot, actually. Are the services available to you? Are they accessible to you? Are they acceptable to you? And are they adaptable to you? So as a categorization of indicators, it has its role to play. Now, what if you say, I like them all? Well, let me explain the big one first. What are structural indicators? Structure indicators capture the commitment or the intent of the state to undertake measures in support of the convention. Process indicators capture whatever mechanisms that administrative devices or procedural devices that are used to begin implementation, and outcome indicators of what you would expect, namely the results. Another way of putting it is structural indicators give commitment, process indicators look at what efforts have been made, and outcome indicators give the actual results. Now, the Hunt framework is dominant in the literature for a good reason, because it looks like it really covers a nice spread of issues that you want to make sure the governments are engaged in. In practice, however, and we'll be hearing, I presume, we'll be hearing from a representative from fraud in a minute, outcome indicators are the least important. Because it turns out that you get more bang for your buck in the indicator business if you can identify the efforts made, the processes that have been created to engage in compliance rather than actually getting outcomes. Part of the reason for this is that outcomes can only be assessed longitudinally, because you can't do it once and say you've done. You have to keep monitoring it, and that's expensive. And also these outcomes are hard to get good proxies for. We have much more successful proxies for process. Structural indicators are pretty straightforward. The one that's usually used is ratification itself is a structural indicator. While respect, protect, and fulfill, we've already looked at earlier on today, is a very, very robust and useful distinction between a state's obligation to secure non-interference, prevent violations by non-state actors, and fulfill, engage in positive action. I'm always attracted to it. But as I said before, what if we decide to have just two of these structural indicators or frameworks together, as is often done? Then you have a matrix, a 3x3 matrix of structure, process, and outcome on top, respect, protect, and fulfill along the other axis, and you have to come up with separate indicators for each of those cells. Now, I'm going to give you some examples of people doing that. The first one, however, looks at structure, process, and outcome indicators, and this is along the matrix of availability. I'm giving it not to read through it, but just to give a sense of the complexity of indicator development when you match more than one framework. In this case, you're looking at the Hunt structure, process, outcome framework along this other axis, the 4A, and there's accessibility. Now this one is in education alone, so these would be the indicators in education, and multiply this by the other substantive rights in the convention, and you'll see that your indicators would be huge in number. Practically speaking, although this is up for negotiation and debate, and we're in early stages, practically speaking, anything more than 20 indicators would be unfeasible for most countries. And on these two pages, I'm giving you about 80 of them. So you can see that this is a challenge of just finding the ones that do the job. Well, how about some other examples? And I'll finish with this. Great Britain in the UK Office of Disability Issues in 2011 came up with these. I'm going to give you just one or two. Article 5, Equality and Non-Discrimination, their indicator was experiential. So they decided to go with a qualitative indicator. Percent of individuals who were treated unfairly in the past by disability status. Now this is disaggregated not just by disability, but by kind of disability. And I don't know how they do that in the UK office. But keep in mind that the only way you get data with regard to this is people reporting levels of satisfaction. Living into an Article 19 indicator, their description of the indicator is percentage of disabled individuals who believe that they do not frequently have choice. So once again, you have a qualitative or subjective experience indicator. Now, this is telling to me because it's easier, structurally easier, to have these kinds of indicators. But keep in mind, whenever you say the number of people who believe something, they may be wrong. They may be wrong. And Sen's point is, if people say, no problem here, and they're massively discriminated against, you don't want to believe people who are massively discriminated against. Sen's example was low-caste Indian women in India who were subjected to a standard panel of quality of life questions, and it was discovered that these individuals who have a lifespan of 30 years, complete poverty, don't have meals from one day to another, their children die, more than 70% of their children die, and so on, and so on, and so on, have fabulously high quality of life scores. They view their life as peachy keen. Their life is great. When you compare it to, in this particular article I read, Jewish women in New Jersey, their scores are very low. I didn't go to Paris this year. We can't get a better house. So quality of life, which is a bad measure in any event, is a measure of perception of satisfaction. And Sen says, you know when oppression works when the oppressed people are happy. Why is this? Because oppression means you are bringing it to yourself, and the women who had high standards of happiness were saying, my standard is here, and I reach it really easily. So if your expectations are really low, your satisfaction at reaching them is high. And this is just a feature of subjective reports. It's a problem when you have people who are sufficiently oppressed that they believe they're inferior. They believe they don't deserve anything. They believe that discrimination is the way the world should be. And if you ask individuals like that, keep in mind, not every person with a disability is an advocate. And that's why I mentioned consciousness raising yesterday. If you believe that your fate is deserved, you will be happy in that state, at least with respect to these instruments, the quality of life. So, I worry about quality of life and satisfaction and belief questions just for this reason. Skipping it through, I want to bring your attention to the Zero Project, which has its report out, which is looks across Europe only, right? It's just Europe across, okay, I forgot this. Comparing potential indicators in this case, accessibility of new buildings, to give, it's a really good resource. And I'm going to stop with this because this comes from a report from a bunch of Korean human rights researchers. This is what happens when you can measure human rights longitudinally. Now this is a graph with lots of lines that are going up and down, and it's very complex, but the 5 lines that are going across time, it's from 1990 to 2007, reflect indexes, summary measures, if you like, of labor rights, rights of women, and so on. And what they were able to do, since they had these indexes and the data across this time period, they were able, in this article, to track changes in government, economic indicators, the passage of anti-discrimination laws, and notice that they were able to show the impact of certain social changes, especially changes in conservative to liberal political changes, over time in these different areas. If you have that information, it's extremely useful, extremely useful. One last thing, there is a framework, presumably could be called a framework, by the American outfit of, I can't read it, Center for Economic Social Rights, which I suggest to you, the so-called OPRA framework. We are using this as a device for one of our projects, and it's extremely complicated. Here's the simplified version of it. It's a combination of resource assessments and what are called resource opportunity thresholds, as say what a country could fairly be held accountable for certain outcomes, policy effects, and assessments. It's an interesting overall framework. These are my worries, and I'll end with this. The four worries, there have been several, but let me just go through these. It has been objected that indicators and the whole machinery, the quantitative machinery of data, indicators, and enforcement mechanisms and measurement mechanisms, is just too technical and inaccessible. What this, and which is certainly true that it's technical and inaccessible, but what this argues for is a point that was already made by you, namely that DPOs should be engaged, and people who have some experience as academics should be coordinating to make sure that these tools are accessible and are available, because they're highly useful. And to say that they're just too difficult to understand is not a good reason for not using them, given their potential value. Objectivity, it has often been objected to that these indicators sort of hide the fact that judgments are implicitly made about the value of one thing or another and are not really objective. Well, this is a complex criticism that I will cut to the chase on. If objectivity means came down from heaven, well, sure, they're not objective, but nothing that human beings do when they assess each other's activities can be freed of judgment. Thank goodness. Judgment making is what makes us human. And if we try to escape into a world of pristine value neutralness, we're not doing our jobs. Just make sure our values are good and criticize ourselves and others so that we don't make mistakes. But beyond that, I don't see anything in the objection. And that just flows naturally into the next one. Sure, you can't eliminate judgment, and these tools conceivably could be misused to say, look at, I don't have any views here, just look at the data. Well, I don't think that's the appropriate use of these tools to begin with. The last one is more complex. And someone argued that indicators close the space for democratic accountability. This is a large issue of political science as well, but let me just cut it to its focus. To get states to comply with the convention, they have to see the value of the convention. They have to be led to the feasibility, the realistic possibilities of achieving something valuable, which they see as valuable, in a way which is achievably both politically, economically, and socially, and in a way in which they are representing themselves in a democratically accountable fashion. Forcing, either through political activity or top-down activities of any sort, forcing on a state a template, do this or you're evil, will never work. You can do it, it just won't work, because states are sovereign. States not only are, but perceive themselves to be obliged to be making decisions that involve the allocation of resources. What indicators should do is assist in that process, not dictate the outcomes of the process. So what indicators should do, and what Article 31 and the whole monitoring mechanism should do, is be a cooperative endeavor toward a common goal of CRPD compliance. That will be difficult, but as difficult as all these pictures were to put on one slide, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You were fine. You took exactly the amount of time you were supposed to. Just we were a bit delayed. It's fine. Jean, thank you very much for that very rich and very layered voyage through the world of human indicators, and also thank you for the great accessibility of your language at certain points. I'm not going to take questions at this point because we are running up towards lunch, and perhaps afterwards or later in the afternoon. Now, having talked about it to some degree in the abstract, here we have somebody who's actually working on it from the coalface, Martha Stickings, who works with the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union, which I suppose is sort of the engine room in relation to research on many of these issues in the European Union. So over to you, you're very welcome.
Right, well, I can start anyway, and just while the slides are being put up. But I hope that my presentation this morning will follow on very neatly from Jerome's, in that I'm talking exactly about the conjunction of Article 31 on data collection and Article 33 on monitoring of the CRPD. Because I'm going to talk in very practical terms now about how FRA is using indicators to support the monitoring of the CRPD in the EU. Before I go on, I just want to say very briefly what our organisation is and what our mandate is, because I know lots of you don't come from the EU, so might not necessarily be aware of exactly our role. So the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights was established in 2007 with a mandate to collect data and to provide independent, reliable and comparative data to the EU institutions and the EU member states when they implement EU law. So we collect data across the 27, soon to be 28 member states, and then use that to feed into policy processes when they relate to fundamental rights. And we cover discrimination as one of the areas of our work, discrimination on all grounds, including, of course, disability. Since the end of 2012, the FRA has officially been one of the members of the EU-level monitoring framework under Article 33(2) of the Convention, alongside the European Commission, the Petitions Committee of the European Parliament, the European Ombudsman, and the European Disability Forum, who are there as the representatives of civil society. And within this framework, our main role is to independently collect and analyse data and to develop indicators and benchmarks to support the monitoring process. And these tasks will form a key part of our work in the area of disability in the future. So in my presentation, I would like to outline the conceptual framework and the methodological approach that we're using for our work on indicators, and tell you a bit about the work that we're conducting on indicators this year. Developing indicators to monitor the CRPD in the EU context requires knowing something and reflecting the legal and policy situation in the EU. And of course, this links directly to Article 31, which, as Jerome mentioned, specifies that data collection should really feed into the policy process and into the implementation of the Convention. So our work on indicators is framed by 5 key instruments, which are particularly crucial in the context of the EU. And these are the EU treaties, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, the Europe 2020 strategy, which is the big overarching policy framework for the EU over this decade, the European Disability Strategy, 2010 to 2020, and of course the CRPD, of which the EU itself is of course a state party. So if we start with Europe 2020 as the overarching framework for EU policy, we can see that some of the targets that are set out within this document are of particular relevance to the social inclusion of persons with disabilities. In particular, the socio-economic targets, which relate to employment, to tertiary education and poverty reduction, are relevant to the development of indicators on equality for persons with disabilities. However, while these are relevant, if the focus of data collection just revolves around the Europe 2020 strategy, the risk is that it won't reflect all of the areas of action set out in the EU disability strategy, which is more targeted to specific measures to empower persons with disabilities so that they can enjoy their full rights and benefit fully from participation in society and the economy. Moreover, the general targets contained within the Europe 2020 strategy can't mirror the specific obligations that are contained within the CRPD. Because although social inclusion, employment and education are of course central to the Convention, it also sets out lots of other obligations, as we know. So whether that be the right to vote, or accessibility, or legal capacity, equal recognition before the law, which are not necessarily part of the EU 2020 strategy. Having ratified the CRPD, the EU has an obligation to implement these rights as they fall within its area of competence. So this means that it needs to collect data on how the individual articles of the CRPD are being implemented by the EU institutions and what the outcomes of these laws and processes are. So of course our indicator work will reflect these area of competences and the fundamental rights which are enshrined within the Charter of the EU. As Jerome has indicated in his presentation, there are lots of different approaches to indicator development that we could use. But given that FRA wants to take a very specifically human rights approach to indicator development, we use the structure, process and outcome framework which was developed by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I'm going to talk very briefly about this framework because of course we ran through it already, but I would really suggest that if you're interested and you want to know more, that you read the big OHCHR publication on this, which is called Human Rights Indicators, A Guide to Measurement and Implementation. And I think I put that on the list of secondary reading for this session, so the link should be there. So structural indicators, as Jerome mentioned, can reflect the ratification and adoption of legal instruments and the existence and creation of institutional mechanisms that are necessary for the promotion and protection of fundamental rights. So what does this mean? Well, it typically includes ratification of the CRPD without any reservations or declarations related to particular articles, but it can also include things like the time frame and the coverage of the national policy to implement the CRPD, so the national disability strategies that Eleanor was talking about earlier. And it can also include, say, the identification of a focal point under Article 33. Process indicators are more about measuring duty bearers' ongoing efforts to transform their human rights commitments into the desired results. And this involves indicators that continuously assess the policies and the measures that are being taken to implement the commitments on the ground. So this can include indicators based on, say, budget allocations, to complaints about discrimination on the grounds of disability, or awareness-raising measures to address the segregated employment of persons with disabilities. Outcome indicators capture the individual and collective attainments which reflect the enjoyment of human rights in a particular context. So they can contextualize over time the impact of these different underlying processes. And an example of outcome indicators could be, say, the proportion of buses that are accessible to persons with disabilities, or the number of persons with disabilities who are elected to Parliament, or the number of personal assistants who are providing support in the community. So what would this task of defining and populating indicators using the SPO framework look like in practice, and how can we try to make it operational? How can we turn it into something concrete? To illustrate how we at FRA are going about this, I'm going to use the example of our current project this year, which is indicators on the political participation of persons with disabilities. This project builds upon previous research that we did, which looked at the right to political participation of persons with psychosocial disabilities and intellectual disabilities. But this time we're covering all different types of impairment group. And it has particular relevance for the EU-level CRPD monitoring because of the EU's role in organising the elections to the European Parliament, which are scheduled for May next year. The project will refine and populate structure, process and outcome indicators in the area of political participation with a focus on European Parliament and municipal elections, because these are the two areas that are covered by EU law. So this again is where our work reflects the existing situation with EU law. And we're also going to collect promising practices related to political participation, which we can then share with other member states. In terms of the methodology, we're employing two different types of data collection. The first is desk research, which will happen across the 27 member states of the EU and Croatia. And there we'll be looking at the legal situation with regards to the right to political participation. So those will be the structure indicators. The policies to promote and protect the right to vote. So those would be the process indicators. And then the experiences of political participation of persons with disabilities. And that, of course, would be the outcome indicators. And we'll be collecting this data in conjunction with the European Network of Academic Disability Experts, of which I know some people here work very closely with. The second part of the data collection will be a secondary analysis of existing comparative data. And this will be based on using data that is already being collected at the EU level, so across the member states. For example, the Quality of Life Survey, the European Statistics on Income and Living Conditions, which is known as EU SILC, and the European Social Study. And as I mentioned, the project has a very clear deadline because we have to produce the results before the European Parliament elections in 2014. And unlike some deadlines, I think that's quite an immovable one, because I suspect we can't phone up the European Parliament and ask them if they wouldn't mind postponing their elections for a few weeks so we can finish our research. So now I'll give you an example of some of the indicators that we're developing and populating through this project. In terms of the structure indicators, the research will highlight the standards that are currently in place in the member states of the EU. So, for example, we're going to identify whether the right to vote is linked to an individual's legal capacity, or whether there is legislation requiring that polling stations and voting processes are accessible, and whether national action plans on disability cover the right to political participation. In terms of process indicators, we're going to look at the measures that are in place to promote the right to vote of persons with disabilities, such as whether there are measures to ensure that people with disabilities who live in institutions can vote, whether training is provided to election authorities and to election officials about non-discrimination on the grounds of disability or accessibility or reasonable accommodation, and whether guidelines are in place to make polling stations more accessible and to support persons with disabilities to cast their vote if needed. Data on the outcome of these structures and processes are going to populate the outcome indicators. which will include, for example, the proportion of members of national parliaments who identify as having a disability, how many persons with disabilities say that they have experienced difficulties when they've tried to vote, and what proportion of persons with disabilities are members of political parties compared to the general population. We've identified about 45 indicators across the structure, process, outcome groups on the right to political participation, and these are the ones that we're going to populate through this data collection in the 28, or soon to be 28, member states of the EU. Now, of course, this work on political participation really just covers a very small fraction of the indicators and benchmarks that will be developed over time to ensure that the CRPD is being effectively monitored at the EU level. And we know, of course, that it will be very difficult and time-consuming and expensive to develop indicators across all of the separate substantial rights. So one of the big decisions that we will have to make in the next few years is how we build on the work that we're doing this year to develop indicators in other areas. And of course, we'll have to decide which areas to prioritise. And on that, in that case, we'd be very interested, certainly, to hear from you in terms of what you feel are the most important areas to focus on when it comes to indicator development. But some examples of where we could go next. So we could identify key elements of social inclusion, which is part of the European Europe 2020 strategy. And then we could try to link these to the disability strategy and to specific articles of the CRPD. We could also then try to tie this into the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, including, of course, the provisions on non-discrimination and inclusion of persons with disabilities. We could look at accessibility in light of the fact that the European Accessibility Act, the proposal should come out in autumn this year, so that would be a very topical area. Or we could, for example, look at healthcare and at access to healthcare, which at the moment is quite an under-researched area, but of course one that's very important in terms of the accessibility of healthcare and whether healthcare provision meets people's needs. So the discussions in terms of what areas that we should focus on will take place within the CRPD monitoring framework over the next few years. And with the help of the CRPD committee in Geneva and their general comments and their concluding observations, that can help us to really build up a better idea of what CRPD monitoring is all about, and what data that we need that would be most useful to help us to monitor CRPD implementation. And these discussions are really going to be what serves to steer the work that we do over the next few years in terms of identifying what is most useful, what really will help to move policy and consequently outcomes in the direction that we all want to see. And I think that's where I'll leave it for now. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you. Thank you very much.